Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda, and I'm so glad that you could join me today. So, we've been talking about different denominations and how they started and what makes them all different and what makes them the same. Today, we're going to do the same, but we're going to talk about a very important period of time that spurred a lot of the denominations that are common today. So, we're going to talk today about a period of time known as the Great Awakening, or some people call it the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. But that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the Great Awakening, what it was, why it started, and what happened because of it. So, if you're ready, let's hit the intro and begin. So the Great Awakening happened as a result and closely related to the Enlightenment era or ideas that were happening in Europe. So in Europe, they were talking about the Enlightenment, and they were talking about intellectual and philosophical differences and opinions and having that debate. And there was questions raised regarding the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, the Lutheran Church, the Anglican, that's how I pronounce it, Anglican Church. There was talk and strife about why they were doing different things, what made them different. And at the same time, there was this new area discovered in the world known as the United States of America. Eventually, it was just known as the New World or the colonies at that time. But the period known as the Great Awakening is more focused and really takes hold in America, in the British colonies. Now, it's not started necessarily in the British colonies. It started in Europe with people who had ideas from the Enlightenment that eventually moved to the British colonies and really spurred that thought and that questioning ability throughout the United States of America, or what would be known as the United States of America. So let's back up just a little bit. What is the Great Awakening? It really is a period of time that comes in two different spurts, and it's where a religious movement really takes hold. Now, America is known as the land where you're free to worship as you choose or not worship as you choose, the freedom to have your own thoughts and your ideals. And really, this Great Awakening is what spurred all of that. That desire to have your own thoughts, ideas, and be able to live your life as you deemed appropriate without fear of repercussions from some religious authority or government authority. Okay, so it really emphasized on a spiritual devotion and individualism and freedom. So you can completely see where all three would tie into what became known as the fabric of the United States of America, with the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech. Like, all those different things are very important. They're very much embedded into what we have as society in the United States of America. Now, this is quite clearly the most significant religious movement throughout the entirety of the colonial era. The Great Awakening. Basically, it was this period of time where people were encouraged to question what they believed and what they thought about what their current practices were. Okay? This sparked a ton of different Protestant denominations, and we're going to talk about more in subsequent videos, but it's because people were encouraged to question, and people were encouraged to have that individual relationship, that really everything spurred off from this. So any religion that is coming up next, so we're going to talk about Methodist, we're going to talk about the United Church of Christ, we're going to talk about Mormon, we're going to talk about Jehovah's Witness, we're going to talk about the Pentecostals. We're going to talk about a lot of different denominations that all came as a result of this Great Awakening, this encouragement for people to question, for people to seek out what they thought was right and make choices based on what they thought was right, and not worry about a bigger denomination, a bigger group, a bigger religious organization. So as a result of this, a lot of people really came closer to the faith, to their faith and their beliefs, and they really took more ownership in that. And as a result, a lot of people started to go to church more. Great. There was a big push because there were so many people going to church. They also started creating educational institutions. Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, and Rutgers all were founded based off of this Great Awakening. I know, it's a pretty big thing. In all, there was a ton of things that they were working on, but really the most important thing that people were focusing on was the emphasis of the power of the individual, not the power of a clergy or monarchs. So in Catholicism, for example, the Pope is deemed as like God's right hand, and there is great power in the hierarchy within the Catholic Church. In the Protestant denominations that we're going to talk about, there is not that hierarchy. It is much more an individual has power. It's not the hierarchy, it's the individual. So there's a shift in power that is going to happen from this Great Awakening. Again, it's people were seeing what was going on and they changed things based on their understanding. And they made new denominations based on their understandings and their beliefs. We're going to talk about the denominations later. Just hang with me. We are talking about the Great Awakening right now. So when did this happen? It happened, the first wave happened between 1730s and 1760s. There is no specific day like, oh, it happened on Tuesday, May 17th. Nope, that didn't happen. It was a slow change that happened over the course of years, but it was the first wave was 1730s to the 1760s, and really they took those ideas that were happening and encouraged in Europe, those Enlightenment ideas, and they really brought them to the colonies, and they talked about being rational and using scientific investigation, and encouraged questioning. And those questions challenged the previous views of the Puritans and the Anglicans, who really had different thoughts as far as the authorities within the church. And that change also changed the view of authoritarian ideologies throughout the United States of America. So if you look at churches today, they typically do not have the same hierarchy that they once did, with the exception of the Catholic denomination, because they've continued. But any Protestant denomination that's coming after the Great Awakening will have a starkly different hierarchy. Okay? Now, key points of the first Great Awakening. Key points. So they disagreed that the monarchs and the clergy were the ones responsible for interpreting God's will and passing it on to the people. People were ticked. They didn't want to have an in-between person. They wanted to hear the word, read the word for themselves, and decide for themselves. They didn't want somebody else telling them what they should believe, what they should do, all those different things. They didn't want somebody else having an authority over them. They wanted to have a direct relationship with God. So they disagreed on that. They also disagreed in the rigid requirements that the church dictated as to how to live. So who you could marry, how you should act, how much you should tithe to the church to support it, what you could eat, what you couldn't eat, how things like that. They didn't like those rigid requirements. So really, if you look at it, they didn't want people in charge of them. They wanted to do their own thing. They were in this new land. They wanted to make their own decisions. Okay? With me so far? So those are the two things that they really did not like. So what they did like, or what they focused on with this Great Awakening movement, is they focused on the individual person's ability to have a connection with God and that freedom to interpret the Bible. So when you read a passage, and when I read a passage, and when Susan reads a passage, and when Sonia reads a passage, we all may get different ideas or different thoughts that are coming from those Bible verses. And a big push for them during the Great Awakening was that everyone's opinion matters. Everyone's viewpoint is not necessarily wrong. There's not one person who's better or more authoritative than I. So just because John is a pastor doesn't mean that he has more skills to interpret and understand and relate to God, to read the Bible, than anybody else. They really didn't want that authoritative thing. They really were trying to get away from that. If you know your history, the United States of America also didn't want to be under the rule of the king. So they got their independence from England. So it was almost like a rebuttal against authority. Okay. The other thing that they wanted to talk about, they didn't like, was the concept of predestination, or the idea that when you're born, God has already decided who is going to go to heaven, who is going to go to hell. Because the American colonies, the British colonies, the United States of America, whatever you want to call that area that we're talking about, because everybody was focused so much on doing everything they could to embody and embolden their lives, their livelihood, they were very reluctant and very resistant to the idea that somebody else could tell them no, they were not good enough. They couldn't get to heaven because, oh no, God didn't want you to go to heaven. You're just a farmer. Oh, God didn't want you to go to heaven. You're the shoemaker, or whatever they happen to be. There was a great frustration, a great anger with, again, somebody who thinks they are higher than them, telling them what they can and can't do. Now, I will go on full disclosure to say that I am a person who does not like to be told that I can't do something because of A or because of B. Oh, you can't do that because you're a girl. Oh, you can't do that because you have long fingernails, or whatever. It really irritates me and rather ticks me off to have somebody tell me that I can't do something simply because of who I am, who I biologically was created to be. I may not be the center forward on any team. I completely know that. I have a mirror. I know what I'm at, like, athletically. There are things that I know I can do and things that I know I am not good at doing. And that's absolutely fine. I know that everybody has different skills and abilities. But for somebody to say, oh, you can't do that because you're female, yeah, that gets to me. So in that respect, I can understand where people at this time during the Great Awakening would be like, I'm making it in this new world. I'm doing all these different things. I'm questioning, why should I have somebody who doesn't know me, doesn't know my struggle, who's sitting in their space and they think they're better than me. They're going to tell me that I'm not good enough. They're going to tell me that I need to work harder. I need to give this much more money to the church. I can understand where they would get frustrated with that idea and kind of buck that a little bit. There is a sense of self that is almost taken away when you feel like someone is trying to have more power over you than they deserve. And so that's something they definitely fought hard against in the Great Awakening. Again, many of the people at that time were farmers and craftsmen. They had made their way in this new world. They came to the country without much. Maybe a bag on their back. Maybe some clothes. Maybe some tools. They had to work to make a living. They had to work to survive. It was a struggle. And for somebody to struggle that much and then continue to have somebody kind of hold it over them that, oh, they aren't going to reach heaven because, oh, you're just the blacksmith. No. What makes you better than the farmer? What makes you better than the mom who's raising the kids? What makes you better than the school teacher? It was this sense of, I am good enough, I'm worthy enough, don't tell me I can't do something. And that tenacity definitely worked well for the people of the colonies, and they fought for their independence, and they were constantly fighting to kind of gain their place in this world. So it makes complete sense to me that they would also be fighting on a religious front, because you live your life as your life. You don't compartmentalize it. And it wouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to fight so hard to make a living, but let's not question or change anything in any other aspect of our lives, in our relationships, in our religious practices. It encompasses everything within your life. So that makes sense to me. So at this time, there was a lot of people who had a lot of questioning, and there were certainly people in the Catholic Church that had questioning, but they still held strong to the concept that hierarchy was important, the church was important, the belief that they needed the church in order to get to heaven. That was very important for some people. And for some people, there was a great pushback from, they didn't need a church. They didn't need that church to get to heaven. They can get to heaven by themselves. They can do these things by themselves. They don't want roadblocks necessarily in there. And that's the beginning of the Great Discord. So if you talk to people today, and they're Catholic or they're Protestant, they typically will say something that tends to indicate that there is some negativity or hostility between the two groups. It's not necessarily that they're fighting like with fists and stuff like that, but there is a great distinction between the Protestants who broke away feel like the Catholic Church was trying to control them, and the Catholics view the people who walked away as, you just gave up on everything that we had. Why are you doing that? So you can see from both points of view. I can see from the Catholic side, if you were Catholic and you're watching these people walk away, you could be saying, you stupid people, why? Like, get your head out of the sand, just buck it up. This is what you need to do. Keep going. And at the same time, from the Protestant side, I can see them saying, you stupid people, you Catholics, why are you following what this person says and doing what they did last year and the year before? Because it was wrong and you know what's wrong. And so there's this judgment between the two groups that both of them see the other as not bad people, but that they're missing the mark. There's something amiss that they're not quite connecting with. And that contention exists today. When I was in the Catholic Church, not the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, I was in the United Church of Christ. I was there for 40 years of my life. In my small town in Wisconsin, the Catholic Church is right across the street from the United Church of Christ. And it had been that way since the town began, essentially. And there was such distension between the two groups that eventually the priest and the reverend of the respective churches had to start meeting midday in the middle of Main Street, kind of causing a traffic jam because they needed to shake things up and help the other people in those worship spaces know that there should not be this distension, this frustration, this hatred, or whatever you want to call it, towards the other group. They're people and they're good people and they believe a lot of the same things, and trying to move past it and unify, it was a huge thing. I can tell you, when I was in that church, we didn't have the midday, middle of the road meetings anymore, but there was still distension. I can remember being in middle school and there was a dance being held at the Catholic Church, and there were people that said, oh, you can't go to this school dance at the Catholic Church because you're not Catholic. And I've also, on the flip side, been at the church across the street, and there have been people who have parked in the parking lot of the UCC church, and then walked across the street to the Catholic Church because they didn't have very good parking. And there would be people who were ticked beyond belief, like to the point that they wanted to put bumper stickers on all the cars saying proud to be UCC, just to tick people off. There is this angst towards each other of, well, you're not us, you're different, you're trying to say you're better than us. And I believe it goes both ways. Now, if you ask somebody who is Catholic, I'm sure they're going to have a different opinion and a different view because they have a different experience. I have heard Catholics say, no, we don't have a problem with Protestants. It's you guys who hate us. And I never felt that growing up. I always felt like the Catholics were the ones that didn't like me, didn't like my denomination, like I wasn't good enough for them. I can't receive the sacraments of communion in the Catholic Church because I'm not good enough for them, is what I thought. Now, I've come to understand that I don't receive the sacraments in the Catholic Church because my belief and my understanding of the sacraments and what they are and things like that are different, and that's why I can't receive them, or I don't receive them. It's out of respect based on what they believe. But at the time when I was in middle school, when I was in high school, even when I was teaching confirmation, it still felt a little bit like you're not good enough. So that contention certainly is still around, still quite heavy. But it all started back in the Great Awakening, when people were encouraged to question and think and develop that individual relationship with God and challenge what they previously had thought. That's when it all started. So, who started this? It started with a lot of different people. And again, it started throughout a very long time. So some of the main people, I'm going to talk about two in particular, okay? So there was one guy, his name was George Whitefield. He was an Anglican minister from Britain. He started in Britain. He was preaching in Britain. He was very powerful speaker. He was very theatrical in his presentation, and because of his theatrical nature, people seemed drawn to him as a minister. And you can see that today. Like if somebody is telling a story and they are just a very passionate speaker, you're drawn to their story, even if it's just about what color socks they have on. A passionate speaker matters. So definitely George Whitefield was a passionate speaker, very theatrical. And he went and he met with two guys named John and Charles Wesley in college. Now, the Wesley brothers started different movements. You have heard of them before, the Anglican movement and the Episcopalian movement and Calvinism. They all started with those little bits. So John, Charles, and George were meeting in college. They were talking about these things that were going on in the church and why they liked it or why they didn't like it and what they were going to do about it. So they were talking and they decided they were going to have these speaking opportunities in outdoor places. They didn't want to go into a church. They didn't want to be stifled. They wanted to be more free, open to the public. So they went out in public, they preached outdoors, and his thoughts were not welcomed by many who had traditional views on religion and what the hierarchy should be. And with anything that we know about history, if you are speaking out about something and people don't like it, they're going to kind of make you leave. So George didn't like to follow the rules. He continued to speak out. He continued to have outdoor gatherings, and he drew more and more everyday people to these speeches that he gave. And because he was so theatrical, people were drawn, and they would be walking down the street and they would see him and they would stop and they would listen and they would become engaged in what he was saying. And that engagement, that draw, really is what sparked the movement. So George Whitefield is one. The other one is Jonathan Edwards. He also was a very intelligent man. He was a preacher as well. Very intelligent. He actually started Yale College at the age of 13. And he graduated not only as the valedictorian, but he also graduated with a doctorate. Nope, that's not right. A master's before the age of 18. So very smart individual. He actually took over the preaching services for his grandfather, who was a pastor of a church in Massachusetts is where he started. So there was this spur of knowledge in Jonathan in Europe, and then they moved as a family to the British colonies. He started in Massachusetts at Yale at the age of 13, and he quickly transferred over into being the preacher at his grandfather's church in Massachusetts. He was very big about the emphasis on human sin and divine judgment, and the acceptance that everybody sins. So in the Catholic Church, they do this thing called communion, where you go and you confess your sins to a priest in like a box. You're supposed to have some kind of humility. It's supposed to be about acknowledging what you did wrong, and they'll tell you how you can fix it. Jonathan's view was slightly different. He pointed out that everybody sins. Everybody misses the mark. Everybody makes mistakes. And that you can atone for those mistakes by yourself. You don't need to go confess what you did to Johnny down the street. You can say you're sorry to God. You can make amends all by yourself. He also stressed the fact about people should repent or say they're sorry. Not just admitting that they did wrong, saying they're sorry, and then asking God to save them or forgive them. Because previously in the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, they didn't necessarily speak directly to God. They needed, again, that somebody in between, that priest, those saints, somebody in between to speak to God for them, because God essentially couldn't be bothered with just speaking to you as a lonely person. really, Jonathan Edwards flipped that and he said, why wouldn't God take the time to speak to you? You are important to him. You value to him, and you absolutely should go to him directly. So he really flipped the switch on everybody makes mistakes. You can say you're sorry. You can fix it yourself. And it's okay to ask for God's help. And for people who are new to a country and have been working very hard to make a living for themselves, that notion, that speech, that thought and idea really resonated with many of them. Very many of them. So he delivered many powerful sermons. The most memorable would be a sermon entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He had such a following, but he was a minister of a church at that time. And because he essentially was being a minister and speaking out against the hierarchy in the church, you can see where that might cause problems. Yeah. He was eventually asked to leave the church. And that was because in his speeches, in his Sinners in the Hands of God, of an Angry God speech, he actually spoke out about the church and said that the church was filled with too many hypocrites and non-believers. And people were saying they were part of a church, but they weren't living it. He suggested having stricter requirements for communion. So having to actually have your character matter, and then you have to qualify to receive communion. Because again, that put the ownership on you. It wasn't about a hierarchy or a church or anything like that. It was trying to put that ownership on you. And people didn't like that. They didn't want to have additional responsibilities. They wanted to keep things as it was. And if you have somebody speaking out against the way things are, then they're going to be encouraged to leave. Just like every other denomination before them. They're going to be encouraged to go somewhere else. Go off in the wilderness, do your own thing. Well, he was in Massachusetts, and there was a whole bunch of things happening. There was wars going to happen. There was a great expansion going to happen. He was encouraged to go do his own thing. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, they kind of paired up. They didn't work together, but they both continued to stir the pot, per se, and encourage people to think outside their box and think for themselves and challenge the status quo. And all that challenging and questioning led to more and more people making decisions to better their own lives. Now, as we talked, there were many people that made a lot of changes during the Great Awakening. And at the same time, there was new inventions. There was the printing press. So the ideas that were being shared by these pastors were widely available to people through the printing press. Now, enter in the Second Great Awakening, also known as the Great Revival. As the expansion started in the United States of America, and people started moving west in the 1800s, there was a decline in the traditional Protestant churches. People didn't want what they always had because they were questioning. They wanted different things. They wanted more individualism. A lot of churches noticed their attendance decrease greatly. A lot of churches started to fold. And a lot of churches started to make changes to the point that they no longer were in alignment with what was previously done or expected within that denomination. Again, more Protestant denominations are to come with this time period. The churches and the expansion. So as people are moving west, the pastors aren't necessarily the first ones to go. They're kind of coming after. The churches that are started are gatherings of people that started. It does not have the same organization or hierarchy that any church came before. It's just not the same. It's kind of like trying to build a house in the middle of a flood. It's not going to be the same. You may be able to get something done. It's not going to be the same. It's just not. And people didn't necessarily want it nor expect it to be the same. They wanted it to be different. During this second Great Awakening, or this Great Revival period, whatever you want to call it, in the early 1800s, there were ministers that would essentially move around the expansion areas to kind of do those outdoor preachings and kind of spur people's attention and get people interested in God again. These pastors were known as circuit riders because they didn't have a church that they were a part of. They just continually moved from place to place. They would host revivals and things like that, a gathering of people. It was always outdoors, so it could be more approachable to other people. And hopefully, even if you weren't attending, you could hear it when you were walking by on your way to the store. So very, very interesting. There were many big meetings. There were many long meetings. These revivals sometimes would last a whole weekend. And it was something new for people to do, and it was something that was encouraging for many people. The goal of the Great Revival, or the Second Great Awakening, whatever you want to call it, the goal was not necessarily to encourage that thinking. It was to rejuvenate and transform the role of ministry in converting people. So it was not about spurring that for yourself anymore. It was about, okay, how can we change this and we can bring more people to God? The whole second portion was about bringing people to God. So if you'll notice, the denominations that are coming up, they're much more about the outreach. The Mormons have their mission work that they do. The Methodists have different things that they do. The United Church of Christ has outreach that they do. There's always this outreach now. They want to get more people. They want to tell more people about it, because that's been a huge part of this Great Revival, or the Second Great Awakening. It's huge. They believe that through this outreach, it really emphasizes the evangelical Christianity standpoint. So focusing on an individual's faith, their good works, and then spreading the message. They believe it is part of who they are. It is part of who they were created to be, is to spread this news and this information to other people. Is it a bad thing? No. But they don't always necessarily do it with the right reasons. To help somebody is great. To help somebody because you want them to buy a car from you, that seems to have ulterior motives. Here, let me help you tie your shoe. Okay, now give me $200. Help me buy this church. Help me build this. Help me do this. Help me do that. Because it's almost like an owing thing then. That has a problem for me. But there is that sense of evangelicalism, that outreach, that is very important in many denominations. And I was a part of that in the United Church of Christ. Absolutely. I was a part of going out there, feeding the homeless, doing these things. And it's not bad. It's just now I can see what it was, and it makes me question, okay, was what we were doing the right thing? Were we trying to get something back? Were we not? It just makes me think of different things. So those were the circuit riders, were the ministers. They were focusing really much more on the individual and their connection to God. The theologians believe that each person could choose to create a closer relationship with God if they chose. If they chose not to have a close relationship with God, they again had that choice. During this Second Great Awakening and this Great Revival, there were many ministers that also fought to end slavery and secure women's rights to vote, own property, things like that. It was a big push for you can have your self-determination, you can have your own needs met with your own free will. You don't need to have somebody else grant it to you. They wanted to make that more readily available. So that was another big change. Now, just like in the First Great Awakening, there were some leaders, there were some different people who kind of spurred things along. Two, again, in this one, was James McGready. I know, lovely name, huh? He was actually a Presbyterian minister, and he emphasized a heartfelt religion. So he was all about the how do you feel and making sure you have faith and do you have peace in your soul. And he was very much about the feeling and getting that feeling to be a quintessential part of your relationship with God. And if you feel it, then it's more reaffirming to you that it actually happens. Whereas if you don't feel it, then there's something wrong with you necessarily. He was very big, particularly in Kentucky and Tennessee. And then the other one was a man named Barton W. Stone. And he, again, was a Presbyterian minister, but he struggled with the concept that all church beliefs were Bible-based. He didn't think they were. He thought more and more were man or society-based. And he thought that that was important because he thought the Bible was a great handbook, but God wasn't living in their daily lives, and he wanted to take what was taught in the Bible and put it into practice in society. That evangelical part. Definitely a big change there. He led multiple church meetings, and he even led the very famous Cane Ridge rivalry. So, very big things. All of these different peoples, this Great Awakening, it's really all about getting people to question what they once did blindly and really focused on having that individual connection, that individual responsibility. Very, very interesting why these came about. And then understanding the Great Awakening gives me a much greater understanding as to what I used to believe in Christianity and a different understanding as to how I viewed the Christian UCC dynamic and what that was all about. Very interesting. I am excited to share with you that our next video coming up is going to be about the Methodist movement. And I am very excited to share with you that every denomination that's coming up after this was significantly impacted by the Great Awakening. And you'll be able to see a stark difference between the denominations that started after the Great Awakening and denominations that started before the Great Awakening. It's amazing. The more you know, the more you grow, as we always say. So if you enjoyed today's video, please go ahead and give it a like, hit subscribe so you can hear our next video as soon as it's released. And don't you worry, you've got another one coming in just a little while. Methodist is coming up next. Until next time, take care and be well. Bye-bye.